Hello, everyone, and welcome to the November 2020 Legacies and Lunch Edition 2. So this is the second one we're doing this month. This is a reschedule from last April when we all went into lockdown and pandemic mode. And so we're happy to welcome Kathy Calloway back today. This is, of course, a program of the Cowles Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and it's held monthly on the first Wednesday of the month, traditionally. But like I said, this is edition 2 for this month, so we're kind of messing with the schedule a little bit. I'm Heather Register Zabindon, the outreach coordinator of the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. The Roberts Library houses the galleries at Library Square, the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies, and the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. We have new hours at the galleries at Library Square and the Roberts Library Research Room. The galleries are open now on Wednesdays and Fridays from 10 until 5 and Saturdays from noon until 5. And you don't need an appointment to come. Just come on down. You can visit the exhibits and shop in the store. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 10 until 5, but you need to call the main number, which is 501-320-5700 to make an appointment and request your materials at least 2 business days in advance. Please go to robertslibrary.org for all the specifics before planning your visit. For details about other Cowles branches, you can go to cowles.org or call your specific branch. I think pretty much all the branches are open 6 days a week now, but please call first and double check. We continue to do a lot of virtual programming, and we'll continue to do it for the foreseeable future. You can find most of these programs archived at cowles.org, at Cowles YouTube channel, or you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to fill your feed with interesting, fun, and educational content. Today's Legacies and Lunch program is actually being live streamed to YouTube. Traditionally, we live stream these to Facebook Live, but we've had some problems with Facebook the past couple of months. So we made an executive decision, and now we're going to do them on YouTube. So please check out there. And also, if you know somebody who's searching for this on Facebook, please let them know it's on YouTube. The speaker will answer questions at the end of the session, so please type your questions in the chat box in Zoom, and I will moderate them and ask her the questions. So now for today's program. Thank you for joining us for today's Legacies and Lunch, now in its 21st year. Today we have Kathy Calloway. She is a professor of English at Arkansas State University. Today, she will provide an overview of the vast canon of Vietnam War literature, the diverse types of stories that are told, the need for writers to engage in sense-making and to bear witness, and the way that this growing body of literature has evolved. This program is part of an NEA Big Read Cowles program. This is an initiative of the National Endowment of the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. The NEA Big Read broadens our understanding of our world, our communities, and ourselves through the joy of sharing a good book. So now, let me close a couple of windows and click a couple of buttons so that Kathy can come on screen. There you go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here with us today. So I will let you take it away. I'm going to share the screen and make sure I get to the right PowerPoint presentation. Maybe. Okay. Can you see that, Kathy, or no?
My PowerPoint or your
the PowerPoint I created, yes.
No, I see a young man's face.
That's my son. Okay, hang on. Just a second. I clicked the wrong button. Let's try this again. It moved windows on me. Okay.
There we go. I
There
can
we
see
go.
part of it.
Yeah, let me get it over here. The joys and wonders of technology. Okay.
Yeah, you can leave that Graham Greene up. That's fine.
Okay, perfect. So just let me know when you're ready for me to switch slides, and I'm going to disappear now.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank Cal's and the Butler Center and Mark Christ and Heather Zabenden for hosting me today. And I would like to make a few acknowledgements to those in the past that have helped me provide a community of study for the topic that I'm going to talk about today, Vietnam War literature. I've been working in this field since 1980. It began when I took a contemporary literature course with Dr. Mike Oxshorn at the University of South Florida. And in that course, I read Tim O'Brien's Going After Cachado, which changed the course of my life. Prior to that time, I had been a British literature student. And after reading that one novel by Tim O'Brien, I changed everything. I wrote my dissertation on Vietnam War literature and became an American literature specialist. So the late Dr. Oxshorn was a big influence in my life, as has been Tim O'Brien. And I appreciate the fact that Dr. Larry Brower at the University of South Florida was willing to direct my dissertation on what was then a newly emerging topic on which there wasn't much scholarly material. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Alex Vernon of Hendrix College for all the projects and opportunities in the field that he has involved me in the past, probably now well over 10 years. So I've been fortunate to have been in a community of scholars and readers. There have been a number of conferences throughout the years, Vietnam War area and the Popular Culture Association, the Vietnam Generation Conferences, and others held at Notre Dame, the University of Hawaii, where all of the people studying Vietnam War literature had the opportunity to come together. And it was a community that was quite active for a number of years. There are fewer now, some have retired, some have died out, but some of us are still keeping it going. And there's still books being published. But it's termed the Vietnam War by Americans, and the Vietnamese call it the American War. It's, at the time, it was our longest war. It spanned a 25-year period between 1950 and 1975. And there's a prolific body of literature out there, roughly thousands of works. Most, Graham Greene's The Quiet American is actually the first Vietnam War novel, probably. It's a British work, actually, published in 1955. It focuses on the way that Americans interfered in British and French colonialism in Southeast Asia. And Graham's novel was followed in 1958 by Eugene Burdick and William Lederer's American bestseller, The Ugly American, which treats the failure of diplomacy, American diplomacy in Southeast Asia. So both of these works were written in the Cold War era, while Americans were serving as advisors to the Vietnamese and were not seriously involved in the war effort. Yet both accurately predicted that participation in such a war would not bode well for either politically or militarily for the United States or the Vietnamese. In fact, Senator William Fulbright implied that Burdick and Lederer were traitors because they portrayed the American government negatively in their novel. And the United States Information Service tried to keep the novel from being sold outside of Britain. And then, of course, most of us familiar with Robin Moore's The Green Berets, which was made into a movie. It achieved a status as a popular novel. back in the early 60s. Slide, please. These are slides of slide of some with the covers of some of the earlier works, the more canonical Vietnam War novels. These were published while the United States was actively fighting in Vietnam for the most part, and treated events that occurred on Vietnamese soil. We had a lot of mass market presses that produced these small volumes very quickly. At the time, of course, we didn't have the internet searches that we have today, where we can quickly find materials on just about any topic. But then I found a lot of these actually by just going to bookstores and reading, browsing through the shelves in the fiction section and pulling titles out and looking at them and go, oh, yeah, this is another Vietnam War text. And I spent one entire summer just reading books like this. But Fields of Fire by James Webb is one of the most common ones. Sand in the Wind by Robert Roth. Body Count, as you can see, One Very Hot Day, The 13th Valley, John Del Vecchio. These are all well-known texts published in the early years. Many by authors who perhaps served in the war and then came home and wrote about it. So these are some of the classics, and they're considered ones that deal with certain traits that I'll talk about in just a minute. But let me just give you an idea of the way that what these books show and the way that the war differed a little bit from other wars. We fought the war primarily between 1961 and 1975. Before that, and in the late 50s, we were there as advisors to the Vietnamese, not actually as troops on the ground until a little bit later. It was a diverse war, and it was not just one war, but many wars. It had inconsistencies in military tactics and morals and politics. The soldier that fought on the front lines faced a different war from the bored soldier who spent his days shuffling paper in relatively secure areas. And the soldier who served in the late 50s to the mid 1960s fought a different war than that of the soldier who served after the Tet Offensive in 1968. The average age of the American soldier was 19. The enemy could not be clearly identified. Children were sometimes used as weapons. The typical soldier served a one-year rotation of only 365 days, except for Marines. They were considered extra tough and got a 13-month tour instead of 12 months. We had some unpopular or incompetent officers who were fragged or killed by their own men. The image of Russian roulette became a main motif. Peter Roundy, one of the scholars, early scholars on the literature of the war, stated that by trying to make it seem brief by sending soldiers there for only 1 year, American decision makers actually made it seem like it lasted forever. Quote, instant communications, air mobility, and the spontaneity of combat made for sequences of experience that seemed to be outside of time, Roundy writes. The periods of extended boredom isolated mind from environment and also resulted in the soldiers having a sense of timelessness and kind of losing track of temporal order and space. So a little different, although a lot of wars share the same traits. As we can see, the wars going on in Iraq and Afghanistan now, in recent years, many of these traits apply to those later wars as well. But it was hard for writers to write a coherent narrative about what many seem many think have been an essentially formless and fragmented experience. In the first seminal study of the war's literature, Peter Bidler identified a main focus of many of the literary works as sense-making. Quote, that what sense was to be made of the war would at all lie in the self-conscious exploration of relationships between experiential and aesthetic possibilities of truth-telling, end quote. So the relative nature of truth, the inability to pin down what truth-telling is, has been an overriding concern of the literature of the Vietnam War. Tim O'Brien, in his award-winning novel, The Things They Carried, for instance, constantly questions the contradictory nature of truth and the reality of the stories that the characters tell. In the chapter Good Form, O'Brien's narrator, who's also named Tim O'Brien, that's a fictional device, tells several versions of an event that involves the killing of a Vietnamese soldier. An event first mentioned in a chapter named Spin, and then narrated more fully in The Man I Killed, and then in a chapter named Ambush. But the narrator constantly changes the details and finally admits even that story is made up. So story truth and happening truth, as O'Brien terms them, continually shift. They replace each other. They lead the reader to question whether or not any version is believable. And with Vietnam, it depended on where you served, in any war, where you served, when you served, what era you were there. You'll get as many war stories as you have people who were actually in a war. It was not a territorial war with defined lines. We did not take territory and retain it as we did in the earlier world wars. Paul Berlin, the protagonist in Tim O'Brien's Going After Cachado, points out that the war was undefinable and disorderly. In fact, actuality, the actual soldier knew very little about it. They didn't know even the simple things, O'Brien writes, quote, a sense of victory or satisfaction or necessary sacrifice. They did not know the feeling of taking a place and keeping it, securing a village and then raising a flag and calling it a victory. They did not have targets. They did not have a cause. So land that was retained was sometimes just, almost immediately abandoned. As we see in these early novels like Body Count, if you've seen the movie Hamburger Hill, you will have seen the same thing happen. They work continuously to try to take that hill and then abandon it almost immediately afterwards. So these novels that we have on this slide are modeled on the long, sweeping canonical novels, for the most part, not One Very Hot Day perhaps, but the other four. Where Malcolm Cowley states, quote, the hero enlists, he has adventures, and then he comes home. Or he goes into action, he's suffered, he's killed. Or there might be a hero, a collective hero, a platoon, a ship's company, they bring them together, they become a living unity, and then they're dissolved at the end of the campaign, end quote. So from this type of novel came what we call the melting pot platoon, where you have soldiers of different nationalities and backgrounds, say the Midwesterner, the New Yorker, the Texan, the Hispanic character, the African-American character. They would all come together and serve in a platoon at the same time. And so these novels were sort of modeled on that sort of pattern. And James Webb in Fields of Fire incorporates a standard combat theme. Quote, man's noblest moment is the one spent on the fields of fire, end quote. Then you have more innovative combat novels. Slide, please. I'm not sure which slide I have next, but we'll see. Some of these perhaps that they focus less fully on a realistic format. Some novels are more experimental than conventional. Actually, the one I should really be showing here would be The Short Timers by Gustav Hasford, which I couldn't find my copy of that last night. Let's see, No Bugles, No Drums by Charles Durden, excuse me. But These are more experimental than conventional. Like those kinds of novels have a little bit of mad logic and more in common with new war novels by authors like Kurt Vonnegut, Thomas Pynchon, and Joseph Heller than with traditional war literature. But then in David Halberstam's One Very Hot Day, you have a character, for instance, and that was back on the previous slide. That's he just walks in circles. He never reaches a particular goal. And then Cacciato, the title character of Tim O'Brien's novel by that name, spends his days in Vietnam chewing gum, fishing fruitlessly in water-filled bomb craters. The main character in Charles Durden's No Bugles, No Drums finds that the main responsibility of his company is to guard a pig farm. So you have some of the absurd things that are happening. One of the best really to read is Joe Holdemon here. He wrote War Year, an early novel about Vietnam, but 1968 incorporates science fiction into the text. It's really kind of it's a great novel, but a bizarre read. You have kind of flashbacks between the war and then the protagonist who's home after the war trying to adjust to what's happened. And he's thinking back to the war in terms, the events there, he's turning them into science fiction to better cope with them because the reality of it's just a little too much to handle. So the protagonists in Vietnam War literature try to make sense out of a world that's fragmented, that's disjointed, it seems to be incoherent. Another novel, Stephen Wright's Meditations in Green, describes the war as, quote, incredible boredom punctuated by exclamation marks or orgastic horror, end quote, or, quote, as a joke without a punchline, end quote. A lot of grotesque scenes are described ironically, perhaps with the use of understatement. Many of the books have a special terminology or what we call an argot, where you have to have a glossary. The authors provide a glossary at the end of the text so that the reader can translate the special terms that are used in this particular war. But the soldiers created this argot to help the protagonist cope with the dehumanizing reality of warfare. As Phillip Byler states, Vietnam War novels, quote, do not include among their number a single one that does not get down in one way or another to a similar vision of a war operating at some absolute human bottom line. When it is not pure insane atrocity, it is a dismal black joke or some creepy unhinged combination of both, which is perhaps why some writers like Holdemon have turned to science fiction. Holdemon in 1968 gives us a running commentary not only on the historical events that occurred in 1968, a seminal year in Vietnam, but also, well, to back up, where they had the Tet Offensive, My Lai, Khe Sanh, events like that, but also what was taking place in the United States at the same time. The Civil Rights Movement, the riots in Washington, D.C., the 60s counterculture, the assassinations of major figures like Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. So Holdemon reminds us of the insanity that's blended in these atrocities, that a nation is trying to process events, actual events that seem surreal. We have a number of nonfiction works as well. I don't have a slide of these, I'm sorry. Ron Kovic's 1967 Born on the 4th of July, made into the well-known movie. Philip Caputo's 1977 A Rumor of War. W.D. Earhart's 1983 Vietnam Precoce. One of the best known personal narratives is Tim O'Brien's If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, which details the year that he spent in Vietnam in the late 1960s, first as a grunt or a foot soldier, then as a battalion clerk at LZ Gator. O'Brien began publishing in forums like Playboy, the Minneapolis Tribune, the Washington Post, while he was serving in Vietnam. And then when he came home, he sat down and on his living room floor, he started assembling the sketches into a book form and turned it into a memoir. And it's actually, I think it's his second book published, but it's his, oh, thank you. First memoir that he published. And then it's followed by Cacciato and some other novels, which I'll get to in a minute. So a lot of the presence in most of these memoirs is, according to Jacqueline Lawson, one of our early scholars, says you have an old kid, you know, he goes out and he tells the story of his war. He's kind of brash about it. He's stricken, but he's elegiac. He's polemical, but, quote, he always begins, you know, with the pervasive power of truth-telling that only the eyewitness can claim, end quote. Then you have journalists like Michael Herr, who volunteered to traverse the landscape of Vietnam. They flew into war zones on helicopters, spent time out in the boonies with soldiers, and they offer eyewitness accounts as well. Dispatches is one of the best known of those. So the literature, excuse me, I'm sorry, it's allergy season. The literature of the war has evolved considerably since these early works. Today, we have all kinds of genre. There's poetry, there's drama, there's science fiction, detective fiction, scrapbooks, letters, oral histories by writers who span the globe. We have Australian writers who have published about the Vietnam War. You have the Korean and Japanese experience as well. Many of the early writers seem to have done so for catharsis. It was a means of coming to terms with their war experience. They wrote one book only, and then disappeared from the literary scene. Some of the ones that you have here, like Larry Heinemann, he's published 3 or 4 books that deal with the war. Haldeman's well known, but these other writers, you don't find, you may not find anything else out there by them, or they may have turned to a different subject if they continue to write. But you do have a contingency of writers that continued to publish well beyond the war era, including Larry Heinemann, as I mentioned. Phillip Caputo did. James Webb has published a number of books. Poets like W.D. Earhart, John Balaban, Bruce Weigel, Walter MacDonald, the dramatist David Rabe, Yusef Komunyakaa, the poet, but perhaps best known for fiction is Tim O'Brien. Slide, please. Thank you. Is Tim O'Brien. These 3 books are what is considered his Vietnam trilogy by readers and scholars. Now you have to understand that Tim O'Brien does not consider himself a Vietnam War writer. He does not consider himself a war writer at all. He considers himself a fiction writer. But these 3, Going After Cacciato, that's the original edition that I read in grad school that changed my life. Then The Things They Carried, 2 books later, was the next Vietnam-related text that he had. In between came The Nuclear Age, which deals with a draft resistor, actually. And then In the Lake of the Woods, which deals with the My Lai massacre. All of his books touch on Vietnam in some way, but his personal narrative and then these 3 novels are the ones that are probably best known for the inclusion of the war. So war is in all of the 9 books that O'Brien has published since 1973. And poets like W.D. Earhart have published in other genres as well. He's written memoir, fiction. John Balaban has also written some nonfiction. Gustav Hasford only lived long enough to publish 3 novels, But his first work, The Short Timers, was the basis for the popular film Full Metal Jacket. And we don't know what kind of legacy he would have left us had he not died at a young age. And then, of course, you have George Davis's 1971 Coming Home, which was made into a movie. And of course, Winston Groom's Forrest Gump, also very well known and made into the movie with Tom Hanks. We also have a lot of overlooked experiences that are starting, that have, well, since the late 90s have actually been treated in literature, but not as fully as some of the other writers. The Hispanic experience is still evolving. It's been emphasized by George Mariscal in 1999 in a collection of Chicano and Chicana writing by primarily little-known writers. Slide, please. I think maybe I have this one next. No, okay, these are the poets. I should have pulled that up earlier, I'm sorry. Dinky Dow is Yusef Komunyaka's, one of his best-known poetry books about the war, and then Walter McDonald's After the Noise of Saigon, and then Horace Coleman's Grass. Okay, slide, please. Winning Hearts and Minds, I should have mentioned that. That is the volume that kicked off the poetry text. I've only had this copy a couple of years. I had to go out on the internet and find it and buy it. I did not know about it at the time that it was published, but it was published by the First Casualty Press in 1972, which was formed by writers Larry Rotman, Jan Barry, and Basil Bouquet. And they edited this volume of a little over 100 poems. And it was a groundbreaking event because it really helped to advance this body of work. You basically had two types of poets that emerged from the war. What we call the canonical stateside poets. These are writers who wrote in the United States, but didn't actually serve in the war. And then you have what we call the veteran writers, and these are those who were actually soldiers in Vietnam and came back and published their works. So these are war poems by Vietnam veterans in Winning Hearts and Minds. So this was really a crucial text, and it led to many other poems being published. One thing that always has amazed me about this is these writers don't seem to think that other people in the field are that aware of their works. I've had some of these poets send me copies of their books and introduce themselves to me in a letter, knowing that they knew that I did work on the war, but they thought maybe I didn't know about them. And I did. I had, a lot of their work and had been treating it, but they seemed to think that they were kind of out there in a void where that a lot of people just didn't simply know about their text. And we finally did have some critical material published, several books on the poetry of the war, and we still have some coming out today. But they were very modest and unassuming in thinking that their work would not be known, when actually it was very well known. So we have the canonical writers and then the veteran writers. And then in terms of drama, David Rabe, and I'm sorry, I don't have a slide of his, any of his books, but is one of the most popular dramatists of the war. He wrote Sticks and Bones, The Training of Pablo Hummel, Streamers, all very powerful plays that generate images of Vietnam and its dangers. And you have Emily Mann, who wrote Still Life, and other writers in here. But back to the Hispanic writers, I'm sorry, I kind of skipped around a little bit there, but the anthology that came out in 1999 by George Mariscal is another groundbreaking anthology because he's publishing little-known writers And I think I do have a slide of that, Heather, if we could skip forward. Oh, okay, these would be 2 other poetry anthologies by veterans, soldier poets of the Vietnam War. And then that's a slide of Earhart's, one of his personal narratives. Okay, I think we can advance to the next slide there. Okay, skip her for a minute. Let's see. Thank you. Okay, here we go. These are the Hispanic writers. We have Ybarra's Vietnam Veteranos, and then the Aztlan in Vietnam, the anthology I was talking about. Because most of the writers in these books are not known. They are people who protested the war in the United States, maybe some who actually went to war, particularly in the oral history here, Vietnam Veteranos. But the other, there are like 60 people in there. And I had to quote some of these for a paper that I published, and it was difficult because I had to get permission. Poetry, you have to get permission. Sometimes you have to pay a lot of money to quote it in an article or a book. And since this book had a small print run and many of the people in there were either no longer living or could not be found, the publisher gave me permission to do it without charge, because the book had I think a print run of maybe 500 copies. So, but we were very careful with this. Anybody that we thought might have family members out there that would object, we had to kind of work around that. Okay, so let's see. We have a lot of African-American literature about the war also, but that has not, we don't really have much in the way of criticism on that. There's a book in progress I keep thinking will come out, but it hasn't yet. But let's see if I can find some of the titles for, George Davis is Coming Home, A.R. Flowers, DeMojo Blues. Arthur Flowers is great. We've had him at Arkansas State for our Delta Symposium conference a couple of times. But he wrote one of the first novels by an African-American writer about the war. John Williams, Captain Blackman, Anthony Groom's Bombingham. That's probably taught fairly frequently. And then the poetry of Yusef Komanyaka, among others. And then Wallace Terry's Bloods, an oral history of the Vietnam War by Black veterans, is also an important text. I'm probably getting close to running out of time. If we move back to that other slide, Heather, thanks to Linda Van de Vanner. I want to talk for a minute about the women who served in the war. Linda Van de Vanner is, her account here, Home Before Morning, is the one that brought women out of the woodwork. The military did not even keep records of how many women served in the Vietnam War. The guesstimates range from around 7,500 to 33,000. We don't know for sure. We do know that we have a few names of women on the Vietnam Veterans Wall in Washington, D.C. But women's stories had not been told until Linda Van de Vanner published her memoir. And then all these other women came out and went, hey, I served there too. And I didn't know anybody else who had. And the body of literature started to grow a little bit. We do have a couple of oral histories, probably several oral histories actually, of women who served in the war. But this is the main narrative. And Van de Vanner, unfortunately, is no longer living. She died in her 50s, I think, probably of Agent Orange related illnesses. I had the pleasure of meeting her at a conference in Notre Dame back in the 1990s. And she was a very charming individual. She signed my students' books for them and insisted on personalizing each one for the student. And I really appreciated that. But she has the most well-known work by a woman who served in the war. In fact, there's very little scholarship on women in the war also. The one book that does exist treats male narratives first, and then treats books by women writers in the United States who never went to the war, but just touched on the war in their literary works. She doesn't include, that work doesn't include Van de Vanter at all. Okay, I wanted to spend a little time before I run out. The home front is also another area that I wanted to at least mention before I move into some Arkansas writers, that we do have a lot of works about the home front. They kind of comprise a second generation of war literature that writers started writing about what it was like for people here on the home front, mothers. They call them the forgotten wounded, the mothers, the fathers, sisters and brothers, boyfriends, girlfriends, wives, and so forth, of those who had those family members of soldiers who served in the war and what their experiences were like here on the home front. And also with that, you could include soldiers who came home and what their home front experience was like after they got back from the war. And then I also want to mention the Vietnamese people. Their accounts are important too. The Vietnamese diaspora, where many immigrated to the United States and started publishing their narratives about the experience. You have Andrew Lom, who was very, very young at the time. Some writers don't even remember living in Vietnam. They just immigrated here with their parents and then touch on it at a later date, learn what they can from their families, some who talk about it and some who won't. But we have a growing body of literature. In fact, I was asked only last week by a journal editor to write a book review of a new book of Vietnamese short stories that has been published, Quan Mon Ha's Other Moons, Vietnamese Short Stories of the American War and its Aftermath. So we're getting more and more of the Vietnamese experience of the war. Those who are still in Vietnam, who are writing about what they call the American War, and those who have immigrated and have written about the war from this side of the world. And then Robert Olin Butler's A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain, a Pulitzer Prize winning writer who has written short stories about Vietnamese who settled in Lake Charles, Louisiana, an area that's a lot like Southeast Asia. Okay, so let me just segue here into a couple of Arkansas writers. Phillip McMath, one of your Little Rock natives. Yes, thank you. Native Ground, his novel. This is the first book in a trilogy with Arrival Point and Lost Kingdoms. This was originally published in 1985 and another edition came out in 2010. McMath is writing about a South that's being transformed in a war that everyone wants to forget, as one reviewer terms it. He has two settings. You have the rice paddies of Vietnam, and then you have the Arkansas Delta, and he very neatly moves back and forth between these two settings throughout the book. You get a good sense of what it's like in Vietnam as well as what it's like in the Arkansas Delta. The West Coast Review said, for those who wonder what it must have been like to fight in Vietnam, this book offers the best insight yet. But the protagonist, Christopher Shaw, is a Marine in Vietnam. He flashes back to his boyhood on a South Arkansas farm. Some of the richest scenes in the book focus on Christopher's childhood in the Arkansas Delta. The Shaw family lives in an antebellum home. And I love this quote. I'm just going to give you a quote of one line by Phillip here, who, since it's almost lunchtime, this will make all of us hungry. He writes about the meals of, quote, smoked ham, fried chicken, potato salad, coleslaw, tomatoes, cucumbers, greens, onions, cornbread, white bread, rye bread, gravy, fried squirrel, butter, cherry pie, end quote. And the main theme of the novel is time, actually. He deals a lot with the one-year rotation, time present, time past, the fact that Christopher Shaw, our protagonist, will not have time future. Christopher is tradition conditioned. He says, quote, "Not to have been a soldier in my family was a disgrace. It's a long tradition. Southern boys don't go to Canada," end quote. So we see why Christopher Shaw went to war. That's a lot like what Tim O'Brien writes about in his short story and chapter in The Things They Carried called On the Rainy River, where O'Brien there talks about how his protagonist really struggles with going to Canada or not. He goes all the way up to the Minnesota border and thinks about crossing over, but can't quite bring himself to do it. So here, McMath is subtly commenting on the role of the United States in the war throughout the book. Vietnam is a part of our nation's fate. It's a destiny for many that became a historical nightmare. We will always wish that we could somehow alter that past and destroy that fateful time in our lives. Vietnam is not a part of a past that will, is a part of not a part of our past that will continue to be a part of our future. It is inextricably linked to our native ground. And McMath does this very well in the novel in talking about how our native ground is linked to what happened in Vietnam. And I would like to thank Phil too for his generosity in the past. To others working in the field, he's been a part of our Delta Symposium at Arkansas State. He even drove all the way to Jonesboro and back one night to spend an evening with my graduate seminar when we were studying the literature of the war, and I really appreciate that. He's been a good friend and colleague over the years. And then another text, since I'm almost out of time here, I hate to minimize the Arkansas writers because they're crucially important to the canon. 2-1 Pony, An American Soldier's Year in Vietnam. Slide, please. Yes, on over after Phil's slide in Vietnam. 1969. This was written by Charles R. Carr, who was my department chair for about 30 years at Arkansas State. Unfortunately, he's no longer living. He published this book in 2012 from Stackpole Books. I owe a debt of gratitude to Chuck, too, who supported my work on Vietnam War literature over the years, letting me leave to go to conferences to present work on this and giving me my share of department travel money for that. But this book, I'm glad he finally wrote it, got his experience out in print. It's another text that, like Native Ground, deserves to be read. And McMath's book is fiction. This one is nonfiction. So you really, get two types of writing here within our Arkansas writers. But Carr writes a lot about that year in Vietnam, stresses the heat, the wire mesh that he saw getting off the plane, the Vietnamese people. He thought that maybe being there would be a good part of a good thing because he would have exposure to a different culture, to different people. He would be better for having been there. And he said he went to war because someone with less money or opportunity would have been drafted instead of him, that Canada was never an option. His mother had even arranged for him to get into the Coast Guard, but he rejected that option as well and went and did his part. 2-1 Pony refers to a 12-ton armored track. It would stop explosive fragments and rifle fire, but not rocket-propelled grenades. So it was a dangerous place to be. Had a machine gun on top of it. You can sort of see the track in the picture there. But he goes through his time there. He spent a certain amount of time actually out in the bush, out on the ground as a foot soldier. And then he ended up serving as a clerk in the rear when they realized he had a degree in English and degrees had started graduate school in philosophy. They put him in the rear to type reports and write. Realized he could write, so that got him out of the field there. he has a lot of different chapters on different things, and Chuck always had a wonderful sense of humor. But he has some chapters that just detail folk tales like black syphilis, sex and prostitutions, soldiers that could stay in a base camp for several days and no one noticed that they were there. It kind of reminds me in a way some of the things that Tim O'Brien writes about in the things I carried, particularly in Sweetheart of the Song Trebong, a chapter there where a guy brings his girlfriend into the war, manages to get her to Vietnam. And then, of course, she shocks all the guys because she really gets into the war. And they didn't expect her to do that. She wasn't supposed to like the war, to enjoy it, and to start hanging out with the Green Berets. Another one of Chuck's things is taking a suitcase full of fireworks to the war. Some guy managed to do, or there was at least a rumor, a folk tale that he managed to do that. He also tells a lot of short jokes. This was in regard to the 1 year rotation. It's so short that when he laces up his boots, you can only see the top of his head. Or he's so short, he's to look up, he's going to see a dog's belly, things like that. But I'll stop there because I know we're almost out of time and I want to allow time for questions. Thank you for your patience with me as I move through what's really an extremely long canon of literature and hard to cover in less than an hour.
Well, I think you did a great job. I mean, I learned a whole lot. In high school, we had to read A Rumor of War. That was a book that was required reading. I do remember that. And so, yeah, so I was glad to hear about that, or hear you mention that. I recognize that. I want to go real quick, and then we do have some questions, but I want to go back to the nurses, because I think for me personally, China Beach, the TV show China Beach, yes, was a big deal. I mean, I watched it every week, and I know that hang on, let me back up. We have a project at the Butler Center where we are trying to document as many Vietnam veterans as possible. I've put the link in the chat for people to go and view. And I know that Brian Robertson, our chief curator, our chief archivist, says a lot. I would love to get some interviews with some nurses or women who had experiences in Vietnam. And it just doesn't seem to be as prevalent. And we know they were there. I mean, like you said, we don't know how many, but we know they were there.
Right. Yeah, they weren't even allowed to march in protest marches with other veterans when they returned, because they said, no, you won't be counted as a veteran. We can't let you do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're hard to come by. And two, there were also women correspondents in Vietnam. And I met some of these women. I heard them on a panel at a conference in Hawaii. And again, they were surprised that I had the book, War Torn. I brought it with me. I had them autograph it. And that one lady was almost in tears. She said, I didn't know anybody had read this. I didn't know that people knew we existed. And I think, how many of them are out there that we need more interviews by them too? And there were entertainers, there were clerks. In World War II, there were even female pilots. So, and of course, today in Iraq and Afghanistan, you have many women who are serving in combat zones as actual soldiers. But yeah, I wish I could find more of them too.
Yeah. Well, maybe once, this is now going to be on YouTube. Okay. So, maybe please
contact us.
If you were a woman and you were involved in Vietnam, as a nurse or entertainer or whatever, please contact us. We want your story. And if you're Arkansas, it does have to be an Arkansas connection.
Yeah, we would love to publish a book of oral histories of women who served in war, who are from Arkansas or living in Arkansas now.
So we have two questions from Guy Lancaster, who is apparently a former student of yours and now works with us at the Encyclopedia of Arkansas. And Guy is always good. I think he just loves to hear me read because he writes these really long questions. So here we go. He says, you mentioned the turn to science fiction in one Vietnam War novel, as well as some of the postmodern elements undermining the idea of truth and distorting linear narratives. common in certain novels. And this makes me wonder how the Vietnam War influenced contemporary war literature about previous military conflicts being published during the war. After all, Slaughterhouse-Five saw print in 1969. Is there any evidence that Vonnegut might have been influenced by the current Vietnam War as he developed the narrative of his own experiences?
It's possible, I'm not really sure, but it's quite possible that Vonnegut, he writes a lot about Dresden, he brings Dresden, World War II into a lot of his texts, but it's quite possible that he did. I'm trying to think if he mentioned Vietnam in Timequake. I'm not sure, one of his later books. My favorite is actually Bluebeard, which deals with World War II. Mm-hmm. But he does mention Vietnam in Bluebeard. Actually, he mentions a number of different wars in that text. So yes, Vietnam is mentioned there.
So here's Guy's second question.
Okay.
Is the gender disparity perhaps less present in the Vietnamese stories of the American War, given that women were much more directly involved, not only in that their homes were being attacked, but also that they participated in military activities? And he references a novel called Novel Without a Name.
Yes.
I'm not going to butcher her name because I will.
I knew I would too. So I wanted to get to Bao Ninh and the Sorrow of War and some of those other texts. Yeah, I think he's talking about a kind of a North Vietnamese novel. But really, I'm still researching that guy. Wayne Carlin has done a lot of work where he's translated a lot of writers. I can show one book here, The Other Side of Heaven, which is post-war fiction by Vietnamese and American writers.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's a very thick book, as you can see. There's lots of material in here. But I'm looking forward to reading the book I mentioned. I'm going to review for a journal that, because I think there'll probably be some women writers from Vietnam in that book. But Leila Haysmith's When Heaven and Earth Change Places, she has maybe a trilogy. She has two or three personal narratives that deal with her life in Vietnam and coming to the United States. But again, those kind of texts are hard to find, particularly if they're written in Vietnamese. And people like me, I would love to travel to Vietnam. I never have. I certainly can't speak a word of Vietnamese. So it's just kind of difficult to find those texts unless they're translated into English and we find them,
Right. So Eddie Donato, I hope I pronounced that right, Eddie, says Fire in the Lake by Francis Fitzgerald was the first book about the war I read. As a veteran, it was eye-opening and inspired me to read many others about the Vietnam War.
Yeah, that's a great book too, along with Gloria Emerson's Winners and Losers. Those two are very well known from the early works about the war. So yeah, good mentions.
And Mark Christ, so I saved this one for the last because I think I know what you're going to say, but he wants to know if Kathy had to pick 3 fiction works to recommend, what would they be?
Other than the war, or any 3 fiction books?
I think he means war-related fiction.
War-related.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
I'm guessing he means
there are lots to read. If you want to read something about Iraq, here's Kevin Powers' The Yellow Birds, mm-hmm. which is a good one. It's hard to limit myself to 3. I have so many. In fact, that's why I couldn't find covers for slides. They're all over my house. They're in the cabinet in my laundry room. They're stuck in, they're somewhere in the basement. They're all over the place. And if I discovered some of my little Avon and Fawcett Penguin paperbacks from 40 years ago are falling apart, which disturbs me.
Yes.
I'm a bookophile. I like to have all my books. My copy of Linda Van de Vander's book, that's the early edition. That's the one she signed for me. I have a later edition. Her later edition has an epilogue to it. So I would recommend reading Home Before Morning, the whole thing, the later copy with the epilogue. he did make a return journey to Vietnam, as did a lot of writers like Tim O'Brien. He's been back. But 3 works, well, obviously the things they carried is a great one to have. As long I could make O'Brien the 3, but then, as I mentioned,
right.
Down to one pony. There are so many that it's hard to limit. But I'll try to think of that and send him an email of what.
Okay. And then he also shared with us the list of Vietnam books that you and Dr. Vernon recommended, and it's on Cal's website. I've shared the link there. It's through our Bibliocommons, which is our catalog. So people can see what you've recommended if people want to read further, which of course they will. And then again, I just want to plug our Vietnam Veterans Project, because documenting these stories are so important to, because I think this is such an important, we talk about World War II and the greatest generation. For me and for my age group, Vietnam is so important because it was our parents' war. And so I just think that documenting this kind of information so that we can, so that future generations, so my kids can understand, why we did what we did. Yeah. I really enjoyed Ken Burns's documentary, The Vietnam War, was, it in a world of streaming where people don't really watch the same thing. When we had network television that everybody was watching, you all watched the same thing. Everybody was talking about who shot JR and all that kind of stuff. But when the Vietnam War came out, everybody was watching it, and we were all watching it together, and we were all going to dinner parties when we could still do that and talking about it. And so I wanted to put a plug in for that.
Yeah, that's a good one. And one of the good things too about a lot of this is these writers, many of them were and still are accessible. Tim O'Brien's come to some of these conferences. W.D. Earhart has, Neil Sheehan has, like I mentioned, Vandervan, and the writers on the Ken Burns series. I know personally many of those writers, and it's just because they have come to conferences and done readings and made themselves accessible. And you'll find that too with some of the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan also, like Brian Turner in particular is a war poet who has done a lot of readings. So there's a lot out there. It's endless. As Alex Vernon and I said on our list we submitted, there are many, many more. We could go on forever.
Well, thank you so much for doing this for us. Thank you for rescheduling from April. I'm glad we could work it in.
I'm happy to do it. Yeah, it was, thought I'd be doing this in person, standing there, but things changed rapidly overnight, didn't they?
They did. So I do appreciate you doing this and doing this virtually. And next month, we will have artist Aquila Marie Walker talk about her retrospective exhibition that is currently in our Loft Gallery. So I hope everybody will join us on Wednesday, December 2nd at noon, the first Wednesday of the month, like always. And we'll be virtual again here on Zoom. So make sure to register for that. Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Heather.
And we will talk soon.
Okay. Look forward.
Bye, everyone.